Hey, welcome everyone to a review of the Amazon Fire TV Cube 3rd generation. Now, if you want to see the written version of this review, you can find a link to my website in the video description. This media streamer is not cheap. Here in Canada, it's priced at a hefty $190 plus tax, and in the USA, it's $140. Switching over to the remote, it's a similar size and physical design to the previous Fire TV remotes. Reaching most buttons with your hand is rather easy. Even reaching with the dedicated button at the very top isn't too bad either. Even though the Cube acts like an Echo device, having a microphone on the remote works well if you need to whisper a command to not disturb others in your home. There are a few more buttons this time around compared to previous generation remotes, as this time you can connect a compatible cable or satellite setup box and use a single remote control to control those devices. At the bottom are app shortcut buttons, but they're annoying if they're accidentally pressed. It would have been better if these buttons could be set for custom commands. One of the great things about this remote is that it can be used to control your TV and home theater devices if they're compatible. This means controlling power, volume, and channel surfing. There is a remote app available for smartphones and the performance is great. There's almost no latency in commands from my phone to the 3rd generation Cube. Powering the remote are 2 AAA batteries which are included in the box. Now switching over to the body itself, it's slightly more attractive than previous versions of the Cube with this redesigned fabric exterior look. It'll look great no matter how you have your home theater set up. The body of the Cube is easy to place almost anywhere as it measures in at 3.38 by 3.38 by 3 inches. In traditional Cube fashion, there is a light indicator at the top front and smart speaker controls on the top as found on Echo devices as well. On the very top, there's a volume control, muting the microphone, and action button. The bottom of the media player has a soft coating, which is great. If your home theater shelf has glass shelves, this will prevent any scratches. Switching over to the back is an HDMI input port for cable or satellite setup boxes. There's an HDMI output for connecting to your TV or monitor, IR extender, power port, a USB-A port, unfortunately not USB-C, and an Ethernet port. Now some notes to keep in mind about the ports on the back of the media player. The first is the IR extender is sold separately, but to be honest, I don't think you'll really need it unless you're in a really unique situation. I've never needed it in my testing and it works just fine. The next thing to keep in mind is the Ethernet port is 10/100 megabits per second. Now for most people that might be okay, but in some cases if you have some really high quality videos you're trying to stream over your network, say over Plex, and the bitrate of your video is higher than what the Ethernet port can handle, you're going to be bottlenecked by the Ethernet port. In fact, if you have Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E, you'll have better performance using a wireless signal, which is kind of weird. And lastly, there is no HDMI cable included in the box despite this really heavy price tag. Obviously when you buy this, Amazon expects you to shop around and buy an HDMI cable from them, sold separately. Switching over to the power wire, it's about 5 feet in length, but when it comes to power consumption, I'm not sure what it draws in. That's mainly because there's no documentation anywhere, including the Amazon developer's website. Not a big deal, but it's something I would mention. There is Bluetooth built into this device, which means you can connect wireless Bluetooth headphones for private audio listening. You can connect a PlayStation 5 controller and all that other good stuff. I'll put links to some of that stuff in the video description. Other compatible things you can find on my YouTube channel. Now powering everything is an octa-core processor with 2 GB of RAM, and according to Amazon, this 3rd generation Cube is 20% faster than the 2nd gen. But if you never use a 2nd generation Cube, that doesn't really mean anything, right? What matters is real world performance, which we'll dive into shortly after. Now when it comes to internal storage space, there's only 16 gigabytes available. At this price point, it should have been 32 gigs minimum. Now some people might be like, well, what's the big deal? Because you can use the USB port to plug in a NTFS formatted drive. Yes, that's right. This is the first Cube device to actually support that file formatting, which is great, but there's a catch. It is rather limited. Now I'm going to talk about the performance and limitation of the USB port later on in the video when I talk about general performance overall in terms of speed and other good stuff. And lastly, in terms of the hardware, the Cube only comes in a black color. As mentioned earlier, this comes with a voice assistant built into it. You can use the Cube as an Echo device, so you can just say your commands, or you can use a remote. And the great thing about having this assistant is that it's one of the most powerful in the world, along with like Google Assistant, for example. So that means it's very compatible with a lot of smart home products, and you can use some media commands on the media player itself. So let's do some samples. Turn on the basement TV lights.
Okay.
Open Disney Plus.
Okay. Disney Plus.
A New Hope, Star Wars. And before we dive into any further about the media player itself, video quality is incredible if the source of the content is right, such as original 4K HDR content from Netflix, Disney Plus, and more. Video is capped at 4K 60 frames per second with support for Dolby Digital, HDR, HDR10, and HDR10+. Now, in case you're running the same issue as I did, I have an LG OLED TV, super amazing quality, but the picture was too dark with the Fire TV Cube. What I noticed is that I had to go into the display settings and change it from the basic default HDR setting to adaptive HDR. Once I did that, the picture wasn't as dark and it was much better, so just something I want to point out there. When it comes to audio, it does support Dolby Atmos 7.1 and Dolby Digital Plus. Okay, so now we're in the software side of things. We're going to switch over to the first thing that you'll see when you boot up the Cube, which is actually also on the far left. It's profiles. So you can have profiles for different people within your home or people that visit, and the profile doesn't need an account to be set up. As long as the main account, which here is Sook, has an Amazon account, that's fine. My wife's account does not need anything in addition. I just create the profile, name it, and that's good to go. And our recommended content will vary based on each profile that you're using at the time. Switching over to inputs, this of course, as I mentioned earlier, does have an HDMI input port, so you can choose that here. Or if you want to do media player, this is how you can view media content from, like, say, devices like the USB stick, which we'll go over shortly. Now, the find section will search literally through everything possible. It could be apps you're looking for, media content of a particular show, maybe even a genre. So I'm not going to type it out. I'm just going to actually use a smart assistant to help with this assistant. So let's see what we can find out. Comedy movies. And as you can see, it'll show up a whole bunch of recommended content based on my search criteria. Now, the home section is what you'll boot into after you log into your profile. Here you'll see recently played Amazon Prime content at the top. This is the last bit of content that I played on my profile. And just below that is ads. Yep, what is a Fire TV device if it does not have ads? It's just not a complete picture without Amazon trying to shove something in your face that they're trying to sell to you. So these ads will vary based on sponsored apps. It'll literally say sponsored apps or sponsored content, such as this, for example, is trying to advertise Paramount Plus to me because I don't have a subscription. And sometimes you might see car ads, like ads for like cars, toothpaste. I'm not kidding. It'll switch and vary. So not a welcome feature because this is not a cheap media player on top of that. Next thing you have is your recently used applications. Next is recommended content for me to watch. This is not kind of stuff I would watch. I mean, I would watch this. I have. It's a great movie. But everything else is kind of like a mixed match. Like I would watch this, which I have. I wouldn't watch this. So the recommendation content is not the best algorithm, but that's exactly what this feature is for. And the rest is pretty much, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, is recommended Prime content. Amazon has done this with almost every media player I've ever reviewed from them, that they shove an excessive amount of Prime content in your face. Would have been welcome if they had like additional stuff, but here you have Paramount Plus, which is odd because I don't have a Paramount Plus subscription. I wish they would recommend more content from other stuff like Netflix, which they do, but you know, where's the Disney Plus content? So here's Netflix way at the bottom, but where's Disney Plus and my other services? Where's Hulu? It's missing completely. So that's something that I noticed. It's kind of an annoyance right there. Now that you kind of see me flipping up and down very quickly, I want to talk about performance. Performance is incredible. Like, this thing is super smooth. As you can see, despite how many thumbnails there are for it to generate for the previews of the movie and TV show content, it's lightning fast. This is pretty much how it performs at all times. Even opening really heavy applications like Netflix, which is one of the heaviest you can use, as you can see, this is like super fast. It was like instant. The performance is stellar. I cannot deny that this is one of the fastest and speediest media players you will ever use. Another super heavy app is Prime Video. Ironically, even though most of the content on the home screen is Prime stuff, here's the Prime app itself, which is a pretty heavy app, especially because they copy the Netflix interface. I don't know if anyone's noticed that recently. But the one I like to demonstrate most often is Disney Plus. That is probably one of the slowest apps on almost any device. I just don't think it's a well-optimized app, but as you can see, it opens up incredibly fast. Another issue I see with most media players, not just Fire TV devices, is that scrolling up and down is a little slow. I just think it's, again, just a super heavy app with high-resolution thumbnails. You see the Cube TV is able to keep up fairly well. So in terms of speed and performance, you will not be disappointed in this media player. Now, in terms of navigation and opening apps, the Cube is stellar, no denying that. But when it comes to USB performance, it's a bit underwhelming. So when it comes to playing content that is in H.264 format or H.265 file format, with a bit rate of roughly 25 megabits per second or less, it works just fine. But when it comes to playing really high bitrate videos, so for example, here's the video that I uploaded for the Sony WH-1000XM5 headphones. It plays back at 65 megabits per second, MP4, 4K, 60 frames per second. So this is being played by the USB stick. and VLC, which is one of the best media player apps you can get. You notice that every time it plays, it just stops, and the audio will continue to play though, but the picture can't. If I fast forward, there, it just froze instantly on its own. I'm not even pausing anything. Let me fast forward again, plays, and then stops again. But the audio continues to play. I think that the USB port is not fast enough to read the media on this device if it's at a certainly higher bit rate. Pretty rare for most people because my video files here are very high in quality, but for testing purposes, I want to demonstrate that the USB port is a little underwhelming. Don't expect great results. In addition to that, it cannot play my external drives. So for example, this is playing off a USB stick. It works just fine if the content is a lower bit rate, like I mentioned. But if it's an external drive enclosure, so I have a 2.5-inch SSD enclosure, they're external hard drives basically, I have a couple of them, both of them will not work at all. It won't even recognize that the cube has it plugged in. So forget trying to play something, the cube doesn't even know it's there. So the power light on my enclosures turn on. It also cannot provide enough power for certain external drives. The other thing I want to discuss is Plex performance. So I know I'm continuing with some nerd stats here, but just bear with me for those of you who are interested. It's pretty much a similar story, even with the wired Ethernet connection, and my desktop is streaming the content, also on the same network on a wired Ethernet connection. Here's again the raw file at 150 megabits per second from my camera, and then here's the same video that I uploaded to YouTube earlier for the review of the Sony headphones for the XM5s. It's pretty much the same performance even over Plex. It'll play for a few seconds, stutter, and stop, and then stop completely. However, when it comes to playing other files, the performance is a little bit better. So what I'm basically trying to say is that playing files from the USB stick tends to cap about 20-25 megabits per second. H.264 or H.265 compression. Plex over a wired Ethernet connection or Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E performs better. I'm able to get about 35 megabits per second before it bottlenecks. And this is what I mean. I think the USB stick is too slow because playing stuff over the network performs better, ironically. The strange thing is if your Wi-Fi signal is strong enough and you're using Wi-Fi 6 or 6E, I was able to stream content at about 45 megabits per second, which outdoes the wired Ethernet connection because the Ethernet connection speed is rather limited. So when it comes to Plex performance on a lot of media players, it does have some bottlenecks if the file type is high enough. This cube does generally pretty good. So even though this is primarily a media streamer, it's not bad for gaming, but of course the games on Android aren't the best. But if you're looking to play something high graphics like Asphalt 8, the performance is pretty stellar. I noticed almost no stuttering and frame drops. Now it is possible to sideload applications if you want to because it's based on Android OS. It is theoretically possible. You can use apps like send files to TV to transfer it over and sideload apps. I do have another video explaining how to get that done. A link to that video is in the video description. App availability, however, out of the box will vary depending on where you live. So for example, I'm up here in Canada, so Canadian apps will be available to me, but US exclusive apps like Hulu won't be available in the App Store. I have to sideload it, but that's pretty much the workaround on how to get that done. So when it goes to my apps, you can see your collection of apps. If you want to get more, certainly you can search around and browse manually, but of course you have featured sections, you have app libraries as to what's purchased, games, and a whole criteria of categories. The amount of apps available is pretty tremendous, but again, it's great because it's based on Android at the core. I'm gonna switch gears, going backwards just a little bit. So we covered the home section, performance, and apps. Let's jump back to live TV. This little bookmarking here at the top. Basically, it's a collection of live TV apps. This can be a combination of news, live sports, basically anything that will stream content live, even some channel apps like, for example, here's BBC. That's pretty much what you would find in this section. And going over to my stuff, this is a collection of Prime videos that I bookmarked. So for example, I bookmarked these to watch on my Prime Video account. This is what will be displayed here. Unfortunately, it does not list stuff from like your Netflix playlist and all that other stuff, but not a big deal, but just something I want to point out there. The last thing to cover really is the settings menu. Now, for the most part, a lot of this stuff is like stuff you want to skip over. The thing that I want to cover really quickly though, that I think is pretty unique, is under preferences, you have parental controls, and here's where you can control, certain restricted content based on a certain profile that's being used. So I think that's pretty useful to know about. And one is data usage monitoring. So if you have limited data, maybe you're capped at, 100 gigs per month usage from your ISP provider, this is where you can kind of maybe make the quality a little bit lower in usage and also monitor your data usage. So if you're concerned about going over your limits, you can actually monitor it here. It's pretty neat. Okay, and that's a wrap for this review. So as you can see, the Fire TV Cube is incredibly fast, Has a great interface to use, it's colorful, easy to navigate, easy to use profiles and all that good stuff. But in typical Amazon fashion, especially in the Cube series, there are some shortcomings. The first, of course, is that there's ads. The other thing is, of course, the Ethernet port is rather limited in speed. And lastly, the other major point is that the USB port is a downer, as it can't really power all external drives, and it can't read data that quickly. Aside from the shortcomings, you still might be interested in this media streamer, especially because it's kind of like an Echo device 2-in-1. Still got some really solid points to it. And that's pretty much a wrap. So if you found this video useful, be sure to check out my social links and website link in the video description. Hit the like button, it does help. Subscribe, and thanks for watching.